Hi, everyone. Welcome to this episode of Claims Never Sleep. And I'm joined again by Jen. Jen, podcast number 2.
So excited.
I didn't scare you away from podcast number 1. You came back for more.
No, I can't wait. I had a great time in the last one, and I can't wait to hear what we have to talk about today.
Well, today we're joined by Cetola, and Kitty is Director of Claims at US Acute Care Solutions. And I talked to Kitty a few weeks ago. Actually, I talked to Kitty 2 years ago, but we had a longer conversation a few weeks ago, and she's coming on. She handles a lot of claims that involve emergency medicine and malpractice claims or that against physicians. And I immediately wanted to bring you on just because your husband is a physician, so you could kind of feel the feels of the impact it would have on him to have a lawsuit against him. So I thought it would be perfect to bring you in for this.
Yeah, absolutely. Fingers crossed, we haven't dealt with that yet in our household, but it is definitely something that affects all physicians everywhere, and I'm really excited to hear her take on it.
Yeah, me as well. So with that, let's bring her in.
This is the Claims Never Sleep podcast, presented by Cruiser Mitchell, with your host, Meghan Henry.
Good afternoon, Kitty. Welcome to this episode of Claims Never Sleep. I'm so happy to have you today.
Oh, thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
So for our listeners out there, we were just talking before we started recording about, we're recording this in May, and we're talking about the plights of having children in school in May and how schools just seem to schedule all of the things for May just to make our lives a little bit harder during this. I guess maybe they do it so we really appreciate summer.
Maybe. It's like recital, concert, another recital, soccer. No sleep.
Yes. Yeah. And for me, I have a 5th grader. So we have graduation, and then the 5th grade dance and, 5th grade fun day. There's, and everything needs a different outfit and a different shirt and, some sort of thing that I need to purchase. It's super.
Right. And half the stuff's on the same day. Like my daughter's field trip to an amusement park is the same day as her dance recital. So I have to drive 90 minutes to the amusement park to pick up her and 4 of her friends to drive them back so they can make the recital. So
is it a little Dorney Park trip?
Knoebels.
Oh, Knoebels. Oh, that's a cute place. I've never been there, but it looks adorable.
Yeah. So happy May.
Well, and anyway, I guess we're not here to complain about our children's schedules. We could do that. Not everyone needs to listen to us complain about that. But just so Kitty and I have been talking, I guess, for 2 years now about having you come on the podcast, and I'm so happy that stars aligned. We finally got you on. Because previously, the timing wasn't right for both, or for you and then me, and so here we are. 2024, May of 2024, the timing is right. So I'm so happy to have you finally.
It's fate. Meant to be.
But as you know, if you're listening to this podcast, what I really like to get into before we dive into talking about all things claims is, you and how you got to where you are. Because everyone has such a different path and a different way of how we bobbed and weaved to where we're sitting now. And, you're a lawyer by training. Did you intend to go to law school? I hear it all here. Some people are like, oh, I wanted to go to be a lawyer since I was 7 years old, or, nope, I was, a musician and I realized I had no job prospects. So I said, I'm going to go to law school. So,
well, I think my story is almost like a rom-com because, I've always liked the legal field, and it's always been something that I've been drawn to. When I graduated college, I worked for a couple of years, tried to figure out the real world, et cetera. And then I went back to law school, but I did it at night. So my journey was a little bit different. I was working full-time during the day and I was going to school at night, which was exhilarating and exhausting and wonderful all at the same time. But I was in my mid-20s. A lot of my girlfriends were getting married and things like that. And I said, hey, maybe that's not for me, and that's okay. I'm really going to focus on these litigation things. I think that's where my strength lies, and that's really what I want to focus on. And then I went to bar study, and there was a boy sitting in front of me, and lo and behold, that was David, my husband.
Oh,
We met studying for the bar, and suddenly the whole trajectory of my life, career path, all of it kind of changed. So, and still is obviously a lawyer as well, but he was also into litigation. And when we talked about, hey, are we going to have a family and how is that going to look? We realized that it really wasn't conducive to have two people with unpredictable schedules and tiny human beings. Yes. So that's what kind of prompted me to look around and say, hey, is there another way to use my skills, my backgrounds, and my passions in a way that works for where I am in my life right now? And it turns out that was claims. Friend of a friend recommended me to a commercial carrier. I started working there. From there, I went to work for a hospital system, both acute care and behavioral health facilities. That was a trip. I learned so much so quickly. And then from there, now I'm working for US Acute Care Solutions. We're a physician-owned and operated emergency medicine practice. We staff hospitals, emergency rooms, some observational roles, literally from New Hampshire to California. It's really exciting and it's really rewarding. And I think over, my career, one of the favorite things that I have done in my work is working with the physicians. And I think working here for a company that is owned and operated by the physicians, it's a special place to be, and it gives me a special perspective on the litigation and how we manage it and how we handle our claims. So, life's a journey, man, and that's how I ended up here.
So, but did you were you in private practice for any amount of time, or did you kind of?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I worked insurance defense. I then also worked for a brief time for an all-service firm that did both litigation and business law for health and tech companies. So I had a little bit of flavor of all of that before I went to work for corporate entities and claims. And I think that background was helpful as well. The first company I worked for was privately held, but the hospital system is publicly traded. So it was interesting to see how that impacted the culture and the decision-making process.
Yeah, and how did you find that? Like, because me, never working for a public corporation, what was that like for you?
I think working for the publicly traded company, there was a lot more emphasis on the visibility of the claims and the visibility of the litigation, and what that might mean to shareholders and what, the impact of publicity issues. There was a higher sensitivity to that, I think, in that environment. And, that drove some of the decisions in the claims making process. I think with the privately held entities, that outward facing concern is still there. You want everyone to think well of your company because you're there to do good things and you want that to show. But it's less of a concern of what the potential impact would be to, stockholders and the overall image of the company.
Yeah, I can imagine that. I can imagine it would affect or impact your claim, how you approach, a claim and how you're going to handle it, because you are thinking it, or you're thinking about the shareholders because other people are thinking about the shareholders, so therefore you have to think about the shareholders.
Right.
You and I have talked a lot about this when we were on the phone before scheduling this. So about where you are now, the impact that claims and litigation have on physicians, and how it really affects them, not professionally but also really personally. And I'd love to talk a little bit more about that, because I thought the conversation we had about it was so fascinating and eye-opening to me too, because I something I hadn't really thought about, and you had some really insightful thoughts on it as well. So I'd love to hear more about it.
Yeah, one of my favorite things, as I said, is working with the physicians, because it's my personal opinion that people who go into medicine, I think for them, it's less of a job and more of a calling. So when they go to work every day, when I go to work, the worst thing that's going to happen is probably I get a paper cut, right? I'm pushing paper. Let's get real. But when these people go to work, they're there to save lives, and they're there for a calling kind of purpose. And I think because of that, it's not only what they do, but it's who they are. So when I have a physician or an APP, because we work with both, who gets sued, they are just oftentimes really just devastated. I remember this patient. I remember talking to this patient's mother. I remember what happened here, and I can't understand why I'm being sued. And I think that's the first hurdle, is because what they do is so much of who they are. When the litigation comes in, it is very personal to them. Talking about podcasts, there's a really great one out there that I refer my physicians and APPs to look at, especially if they're a first-time participant in the legal system. And it's called Doctors in the L Word, and it's produced by an emergency room physician called Gita Pensa. And she talks about litigation from the physician's perspective. She's also an emergency specialist. And for me, when I listened to it, it was absolutely eye-opening and heartbreaking. I look at so many claims every day that I think, just over time, you lose a little bit of sensitivity about it, right? I mean, it's just kind of human nature. But for each physician and APP I work with, this is their case. This is their first time, most times. This is their life. So that was a perspective that I don't think I necessarily really appreciated well enough until I listened to this podcast. I mean, she talks to a lot of physicians who've been part of the process. She talks about things like the suicide rate in physicians who are sued. She talked about things that I didn't even realize were happening, like physicians who don't tell their spouse or significant other that they've been sued until they're about to go to the courthouse for trial. The shame and stigma around it, I did not appreciate how extensive it is. So at US Acute Care Solutions, one of the things that we do try to do is we do try to work hard to remove the stigma around litigation. One of the ways that we do that is we have a program called Litigation Stress Support. And that program will match somebody new to litigation, new to the process, with somebody who's been through it before. Now, certainly you're not talking about the specifics of your case, because obviously we're not breaching any kind of confidentiality or privilege or anything like that. But it's a safe space to talk to somebody who's been there about things that maybe you feel awkward about talking to your attorney about. Like, hey, how do I tell my spouse that this happened? How do I tell her that I got sued? And what does it mean? What do you wear to a deposition? How do I talk to my supervisor about the kind of time I'm going to need off, to deal with the deposition, to deal with the depo prep, to deal with trial? How do I have those conversations? And I think it's also comforting to know that there are other people that you work with who are your peers who have also been through this.
Yeah.
I think that's the saddest part of my job, is when the physicians take it really, really hard. And one of the things I try to tell them, and how I try to manage their expectations also in my initial conversations with them, I think for emergency physicians specifically, it's difficult because everything they do is fast-paced. It's fast in the emergency room. And I always emphasize that litigation is 100% the opposite. It is slow,
Right.
slow. So one of the analogies I try to bring to the table that I think is effective is I tell them it's really like a marathon. You have to train. You have to listen to your coach. That's your attorney. You have to make sure you're eating well, sleeping well, and staying hydrated. You have to make sure you're taking care of yourself, because if you don't, this is going to creep up on you real fast. And you're going to be in a place where you don't want to be. And it's important to ask for help when you need it and to rest when you need it.
Mm-hmm. And I think one of the issues that I think is so hard for the physicians to take is that it's like a blow on their training and their ability. And it's something that they spent blood, sweat, and tears and like I mean, so much of their life on, and now to feel almost like their ability being attacked a little bit.
Yes.
I think it's just mentally, it's got to be so difficult. And Jen's husband is a physician, so she I think she's also was shocked to be like, oh man, he better be telling me if there's something going on.
That's not everyone, but yeah.
No, it's so true, and I so appreciate that you understand what they go through. So my husband and I have been together since high school, right? So I went the whole journey with him through undergrad, medical school, training, and medicine is his life, right? Like I always say, like the hospital comes before me and the kids because it has to. You know, he gets pages at 2:00 in the morning, even when he's not on call, and he responds to them. And if something goes wrong, he will be upset for weeks on end. I mean, they don't ever do anything purposefully wrong. You know, things happen, they're human. And a lot of times I find in the cases where a complaint is made or a lawsuit isn't, they're not even the cases that they're expecting it to happen on. Right. And so it is just, it's a calling. And it's funny that you said that. We had a conversation the other day with my friend, or my husband and a friend who is also a physician. And I said to my husband, for the amount of hours you work, did you ever think like maybe I should have gone into finance or I should have gone into law? You would have worked the same amount of hours and maybe made more. And the friend who's a physician said, I like to think of it as a calling and not that we went into this for money. Right. And so you're spot on when you say that. It is their whole life. And it's devastating when somebody tells them that they didn't do it correctly.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And I think that's you've hit the nail on the head. I think one of the things that I see that is always difficult to explain too is sometimes the expert reports that criticize the care and treatment, especially, you know, you get a hired gun expert. We know who they are. We know what their reports look like. Right. But for the physician who is reading it, this is the only expert report they've ever read. And to them, sometimes, you know, it's difficult. It's difficult to read. Mm-hmm. It's difficult to accept because they don't agree with it. Oftentimes for very, very good reasons. And, you know, they take those expert reports, you know, sometimes really, really to heart. And I think it's a challenge to explain that this is part of the process and it's not specifically directed at you, but then the response is, but this is my care.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's hard because I think as an attorney, you want to share the expert report with your client, also because you think that they know what happened and they have valuable insight and they're experts at this. So,
right.
Like, you know, because in a lot of cases, you know, in other types of litigation, like I might not necessarily give the insured the expert report because I wouldn't be looking to them to get any real feedback on it. You know, like, you know, if someone owns a business and someone trips in the parking lot and there's you have an engineering report about the grade at the parking lot, I'm probably not going to show that to my insured. But with a physician, you're like, well, you know the medicine and you know what happens. You're going to show it to them. And I could see the personal attack. It would feel very much like a personal attack.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the difficult things to kind of overcome. But, you know, it's just part of the process. And that's why I think also it's so important to make sure that you work with really, really good defense counsel. When I'm looking at someone for our defense panel counsel, I'm not just looking for where they went to school, how many cases they tried, that kind of stuff. I look for someone that I can have this kind of conversation with, you know, someone who I can have back and forth with, someone who's a good listener. Because I think, especially for medical negligence claims, the attorneys who are not as good listeners as maybe I would want them to be, those are the attorneys where, you know, the doctors don't feel comfortable talking to them and then problems arise, you know. I think it's super important for this particular area of law, that you be able to listen to your client. Because also, I mean, you made a great example. If you're talking about a slip and fall and a sidewalk grade, you're right. Your client isn't going to really have anything to add to that if they're, a business owner. But if we're talking about medical negligence, oftentimes the physicians themselves are a great resource. And I think it's frustrating to me occasionally when I see defense counsel who are not willing to listen to the input from the physician. Hey, have you thought about this? Hey, have we looked at this study? Hey, have we considered getting an expert in this area? I know defense counsel always has a plan and a map for the case, but I think finding people who want to take the time to listen, I think that's super important as well.
And it's almost like a role reversal too, because the physician is usually doing all the listening.
Yeah.
And I think Jen posted about this on LinkedIn this week, though, too. I think there's a misconception, about lawyers that we're only out there to argue and to prove our point. But in reality, our job is to listen. Like, part of our job is to listen. And if I remember going to one of my first, I think it was my very first deposition I did on my own. And I was going to one of the older associates, and I was like, what do I do? I had my, 17-page outline of every question I needed to ask. And he was like, I'm glad you have that. That's your crutch. He's like, but all you need to do is just listen to their answers, and then you'll know the next question to ask. Don't just go to your outline and be like, okay, ask that question, check. And he's like, just listen. And it was the best advice that I'd gotten, because I would have just been like, okay, question number 1 done. Okay, now we go to question number 2. Because, our jobs are to, listen.
Absolutely.
Well,
Absolutely.
And go ahead.
No, go. I was just saying absolutely, yeah.
And I think the other part about doctors is, for the most part, they're confident people, right?
Mm-hmm.
My husband's a surgeon. You would want a confident surgeon. You don't want a surgeon who's in there and, they're cutting and they cut open an artery and then, the blood's splashing and what am I
maybe this will work. I don't know. I watched it on
Right.
YouTube last night.
Well, don't joke about YouTube, because he does sometimes watch YouTube on how to do things. But he needs the confidence to know that he can solve the problem, right? And sometimes I think that confidence can be mistaken for hubris or for excessive arrogance. And I think sometimes people don't know how to approach that. So now you have a confident person who's also down on themselves because they think they made a mistake. And it's kind of this weird mix that can maybe then make defense counsel or someone else think that they're unapproachable, where it's really just the opposite. And they are your best source. They're your best resource in these kinds of cases.
Absolutely.
And Kitty, have you experienced or seen, the downward effect of this that you might have in a physician that's had a case or a claim against them, and they, it kind of they lose all their confidence and kind of take a step away from the profession? Have you come across that?
I have. I have seen that. It's not common.
Oh God, that's not.
But common. I have seen it. I think what I find more common is, what Jen was saying. I think sometimes the confident person getting knocked down with the litigation rattles them and rattles their ability to perform the important parts of litigation, like deposition.
Yeah.
So one of the things that at US Acute Care Solutions that we focus on, and we try to be forward thinking on, is getting deposition prep and identifying the physicians and the APPs who can benefit from it. Whether it's somebody who's angry and needs to learn how to tone that down, whether it's someone who's sad and cries about what happened, or whether it's someone who's lost their mojo maybe a little bit because of what's going on here and maybe get second guessing themselves. Those are things that don't help when you go to deposition. I think some carriers and maybe some organizations think that something like a Cogent Edge witness coach is something that you preserve for trial, because it is an expense for sure. But it's my opinion that if you don't nail your deposition, you're going to be in for a world of pain at trial. Yeah. And, that's our philosophy, is to minimize the pain of litigation to our physicians and APPs to the extent possible. And I think that it's really important to make sure that the physicians have the skills that they need to perform well at deposition. So our defense counsel that we work with are great, and they are really good at prepping someone for a garden variety deposition when there aren't a lot of baggage that we're bringing to the deposition. But I think one of the other things that I like about our defense counsel is that because they listen, they're able to have real conversations with us about, hey, I think this person needs a little help. Hey, I think, we're going to need to push off this deposition. They're just not ready. I think the deposition is a really important, super critical piece of the litigation. And I think that we cannot underestimate the impact that it can have for the long term of outcome of the litigation. And I think nothing makes me more frustrated than when I hear they're fine, and I hear nothing from the physician expressing any concern. And then I get an email saying, well, the value of this case just went up because this physician lost their cool at deposition. And that should almost always be a never. That should not be part of what we have to deal with and what our physicians have to deal with. And I think making those kind of resources that, hey, defense counsel are great at prepping you for what to expect at deposition and how to answer certain questions. But if you are coming to the table with the sadness, the anger, the hubris, the uncertainty, then a professional coach is really something that's money well spent, in my opinion.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it almost goes across the board though, too, even if you're not talking about physicians, like you need to be able to assess the affect of your witness and how it's going to come across. And, and I think it's definitely a little different. And when you're talking about a physician, because it seems it's much more personal, but even just you're another witness, like, from the prep and from talking to them, their general affect, and you can get an idea of like, are they going to come across aggressive? Are they going to come across combative? Are they going to cry? I have yet to have many. I don't think I've ever had a witness on my end cry. I've had a lot of plaintiffs cry, not because I'm not because I'm that attorney. I didn't try to make them cry. In fact, it happened at one deposition like a while ago, and the plaintiff's attorney had said to the client, like, she's really nice. Like, just take a deep breath. She's being really nice to you. But she was overwhelmed by just, her incident.
Right. Right. And that is very forward thinking. I mean, because how many times do you come out of depositions and you're like, oh gosh, we can never put this person up on the stand at a trial. We have to settle this case now. So their deposition performance or affect or whatever you want to call it really does dictate how the case is going to go in the future.
Yeah. Yeah. And that like $5,000 you pay to coach an edge, you're buying yourself peace from the additional $100,000, $200,000, $300,000 jump you just made when someone, has a less than stellar deposition presentation.
But a lot of that goes towards knowing and understanding opposing counsel, though, too, and how they're going to act during the deposition. Because, I mean, look, we all know that you can play very nice in the sandbox with so-and-so counsel, and then once they're in that room, their personality takes a 180, and they can be as nice as day to you one side, and then they can be a total jerk. And but there is some preparation. Like, typically the players are all very similar. You know who the players are. There's a way to find out, like, how are they during depositions? Are they are they going to try to get a rise out of my client? Like, you could figure this out ahead of time, typically, unless it's like a non-known player that no one's ever heard of, but they're probably not going to have that case.
Yeah.
But Kitty, I believe that when you and I spoke, though, you were sharing that you recently had a few successes with defense verdicts. I think we wanted to talk about. Didn't you have a few matters that you had some good successes at trial?
Yeah, and I think success at trial is really based on a few things. And what we try to do in our department is early in litigation, we try to be really real, and we try to look at cases really, really dispassionately as to what are we looking at here? Are we looking at something that's a potential excess exposure? And separating early on the cases that really need to be resolved and the cases that really need to be tried.
Yeah.
So how would we tell one from the other? I think it depends on a few different things. I know the traditional way of looking at claims is first you look at, is the medicine defensible? Then you look at standard of care, then you look at damages, and then you put together a strategy. We kind of flip that script on its head, and we look at what kind of a case is this? Are we looking at a potential excess exposure? Do we have to contain and control that? Because I know the popular way of saying it is, nuclear verdicts. They are very, very real. They are very, very scary. And I think juries these days kind of have what I would call the Kardashian effect. $1 million isn't what it used to be. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
But coverage still remains where it used to be, where, your typical, generally speaking, your typical medical malpractice coverage limit is going to be 1 million, 3 million. Now, obviously that can change depending on where you are in the country and whether it's a shared limit or not. But by and large, those kind of limits are 1 million, 3 million. Yeah. And when you're talking about somebody who's alleging a delayed diagnosis and stroke, leading to a catastrophic brain injury and, severe mental and physical impairment of a patient, you're talking about a life care plan that's going to be at least $30 million. And I think those are scary numbers. So one of the things that we do is first we look at what kind of damages are being alleged. Do we have a concern for excess? And how do we best protect our physicians? Once we take a look at that, then we kind of work backwards from there. Is this a good story? We look at narrative also, because I think it matters. And I think one of the frustrations I had when I worked for a commercial carrier was it was my perception that people up my chain of command didn't take my comments about narrative seriously. Or well. And I think the narrative that surrounds your litigation really affects what's going on. I think I never like to hear narratives that, the doctor didn't show up, because I think by and large, in my experience, juries will forgive doctors a lot. They really will. But the doctors who don't show up, and what does that mean? The doctor who doesn't answer the page, the doctor who doesn't see the patient immediately, the doctor who's dismissive of and discharges patient early, those kind of things I don't think juries are as forgiving about. The doctor who showed up and ran the code and did his best but couldn't find an airway, that kind of fact pattern is a better narrative. And I think it's important to understand that narrative plays a big role in here. And I think this is a more recent phenomenon, but it's my impression and perception that juries don't always listen to the medicine. They don't always listen to the judge's instructions about the medicine. And I think you have to understand that that's a reality.
Yeah.
So back to your original question was, successes that we've had. I attribute the successes that we've had recently really to our ability to separate those cases that need to be tried from those cases that need to be resolved. And I think that's a big part of it.
We were talking, Meghan and I, yesterday about, especially in Pennsylvania, there are some firms, and the big firms, and if they get a case, everyone, all the defense counsel, like, this firm is on it, it must be a terrible case. So, do you kind of see the same thing? Like, there's certain firms that get these cases that you're paying limits, just forget about it.
Well, I don't think I would necessarily take, say, hey,
right.
John Smith has this case, we have to play limits. But I would say, John Smith has this case, we have to expect a $30 million life care plan and plug that into how we're valuing the case. I think, we all know who these people are, but
they're going to put the money into the defense.
Yeah,
or not the defense, into
the prosecution.
Yes. We know what we're talking about.
And I think key important thing that I think often gets overlooked, that those hard damages in the life care plan or something like that, unfortunately, tend to come towards the end of discovery and on the eve of litigation. So one of our strategies is to try to push for any kind of damages, estimates, and life care plans as soon as possible. And also, we're being more proactive about putting together our own life care plans in these kind of catastrophic injury cases preemptively. The conventional method of case management is you wait and wait and wait for the life care plan to come in, and then you rebut it. But I don't think that that's always effective, particularly if it's a case that you want to posture for mediation. I get mediation is a useful tool, but I always get frustrated when we don't have all the information and then we sit down for a mediation. So I think about one mediation I had relatively recently, and we came in with a number and an interest in resolving the case. Plaintiff's counsel came in and said, hey, the medicals are this. And everybody on the defense side is like, what are you talking about? The medicals are this. All three of us agree that the medicals are this. And, the plaintiff's counsel said, no, my paralegal put together a spreadsheet, so it's this number. And that kind of stymied the ability for anybody to get anywhere because we were so far apart on what the actual damages were, that it was difficult. So I think in that particular case, we might have been better served putting together something on our own, and bringing that to the mediation and saying, hey, let's look at this persuasive, copies of all the invoices, because now the defense counsel are kind of scrambling around trying to get that stuff together. And I think also it matters who your mediator is, because that particular mediator said, and I quote, well, does it really matter?
Yeah, I think it does.
Yeah, it does matter. It does matter because our offer is based on what we're saying the damages are. You're saying the damages are significantly more. So yeah, it does matter. Well, they have a spreadsheet. I'm like, hey, I could put together a spreadsheet that says the sky, the moon, and a couple of ponies. It doesn't mean that those are what the actual damages are.
Like, I can do a spreadsheet right now.
Yeah, I'll do one now. It says you guys get nothing.
Oh, and what a waste of time. Like, and money. It's just.
Exactly. And I think, it's something that we're trying to be more proactive on and serving chief plaintiff's counsel earlier in the case to help them adjust their expectations and manage their clients' expectations. We've all been to the mediation where we hear the plaintiff's counsel say, I can't control my client. And I think, well, that's your job, number one. Right. And number two, have you been feeding them all this crazy, this is a $20 million case for months and months and months? Could that possibly be why? So, we'll see. I mean, I don't have enough hard data to say this is a super effective strategy, but it certainly can't be worse.
Right.
And do you see different trends coming up in different pockets of the country or different areas, or is it sort of the same across all of the states you handle?
No, it's definitely varies by jurisdiction and where you are. Even different parts of the same state can have different jury pools with different attitudes, and that really kind of impacts what you have to consider when you're valuing the case. So that's certainly something important too. We've all seen the reports with judicial hellholes, and they're usually pretty accurate. Yeah. I would not love to try a case in Philly. Let's just say that. Right. Right. It's not impossible for sure, but it's not desirable. And I think, you certainly want to be careful and make sure your defense counsel is thoughtful on picking a jury, but you're picking a jury out of a jury pool, and there's only so much you can do with that. So one of the things that we actively do to try to acknowledge that reality and be prepared for it is we use this company called Magna. They have a really, really great product that I love. It's called Jury Evaluator. So it's not a mock trial, okay? It's more of a sampling of your jury pool. So what they do is you tell them what venue your case is in, and they come up with 100 people in that jurisdiction who could be potential jurors, based on their age and all of that, right? And then you have you put together a script, and it's not persuasive; it's just factual. Here's what the plaintiff's going to argue. Here's what the defense is going to argue, and you put it in front of these people. They're all remote. They're doing all of this remotely, so it's not a persuasive kind of mock trial. But you tell them the story. You tell them the story you think the plaintiff's going to say, and then you can ask them some open-ended, targeted questions. But then you also get information about which side would you vote for, how much money would you give, and then they put together the answers in what they call Monte Carlo style. So they match up all the different potential probabilities. So you have your worst day, where all the people who loved the plaintiff and wanted to give them a bajillion dollars. You have your best worst day. They still want to pay the plaintiff, but it's the more conservative numbers. And then you have your average. So it gives you some data points. For me, I think that's really important, because I was never comfortable making recommendations based on, hey, my defense counsel feels like this is what this area does. They've seen some, verdict research. We know the verdict research. It's never exactly your fact pattern. And that makes it difficult to extrapolate. The reason I like this particular product, and it's not for every case because it's not inexpensive. I think it's about $15,000. So it's not inexpensive, but for those kind of cases that we're talking about, the ones that we really have to value and move towards a resolution, this is an exceptional tool. Because when I go to my committee and say, I need X dollars to resolve this case, then I can say it's because in this jurisdiction, this is your likely verdict. In this jurisdiction, you could be looking at a verdict like this. And then, depending on what the case is, we also tailor some very specific open-ended questions about attitudes and perceptions, about things that are soft. So I used it once in a case involving minors. How did you feel about this person being a minor? Did that impact how you decided? You can ask open-ended questions about how they perceived, the doctor and the doctor's role in what went on. You can really tailor the open-ended questions, and it can give you some insight that really you wouldn't have previously. And it has helped us immensely to more accurately predict exposure based on data points, not based on, hey, this case is kind of similar. Hey, defense counsel feels like it's this, or this is what they'll take. I haven't taken the jury evaluator product to a mediator yet, but I wouldn't rule that out as a possibility. Yeah. I'm thinking about some cases that I've gone to, and you try to argue with the mediator about what a jury in this venue is going to do. And you have to do it on those same kind of things. Well, we think, we feel, all of that thing, those kind of amorphous things that are not hard data points. And I think when you can assign hard data points based on, a really close approximation to your likely jury pool, then you can make confident decisions, you make confident recommendations, and you can make confident demands of your mediator and your opposing counsel.
It's funny. This is the second, that Magna product came up yesterday in a conversation Jen and I were having. Yes. I was like, man, I really got it. Yeah. I was like, this is, like you said, though, it's very expensive. You have to choose wisely where you're using it. But I was like, am I having deja vu? Didn't I just hear about this just yesterday? But it is super valuable because what we were talking about as well is that, we can, as attorneys, we can give our recommendations, and they are, it's an art. It is based on a lot of factors, but it's almost like they're giving you more of a scientific approach because they're actually talking to potential people who fits your jury pool versus what we do is based on experience, looking at the jury verdict research, looking at the settlement research, roundtabling it, and those are all helpful and effective too. but again, like I mentioned this just yesterday too, like what I come up with my value based on those things, and then what Jen could come up with her value could vary greatly just because we're two different people. Just like when you're polling those 100 people, their numbers are going to be all different too. So I think it kind of streamlines it a little bit to make it more scientific than artistic or artful. I don't know what the right term for that is, but it sounds like an amazing tool for the right case.
Yeah, definitely for the right case, because it's not cheap, but especially if you have kind of soft issues in the case, I find it helpful as well. I used it in one case, not with this employer, but with a prior employer, where the allegations involved minor patient to minor patient sexual issues. Mm-hmm. And it was difficult because there was no clear story about what occurred. There were two different versions. And it was difficult for me to really kind of make a judgment call on how people would receive that narrative. And this particular product was helpful, specifically the open-ended. People were way more upset than I thought.
Yeah.
Way more upset than my defense counsel thought. And they're upset with what occurred, really translated into tangible dollar signs. And we would have been wildly unprepared if we had decided to roll the dice and take that to trial. And it caused us to course correct and end up resolving the case for an amount that I feel was well below the potential exposure if we had rolled the dice at trial.
Yeah. I mean, those types of cases are so hard. Yeah. But I do feel as though sometimes there's an evaluation on those that I think fails to factor in just the feel of the allegations. And I worked on a lot of sexual assault cases, and particularly when I was earlier in my career, I would go, talk to the more senior or the senior partner and run the case by them, and I would be like, man, this is like big, like that. I think I would value it really high, and they would have more like, well, but it was only like 1 or 2 times. So I was like, but
1 or 2 times too many.
And I was going like, and I feel like I feel like more people are gonna feel like me being like, well, like it's all it takes, like, and I get it. If it was repeated over and over and over, that just makes it much worse. But yeah, so yeah, I mean, I think a tool like that for a sexual assault type case extremely valuable because I think some seasoned attorneys who work on a lot of those cases, you come a little immune to the emotional impact of the event. I think a little bit.
Yeah, and I think it's valuable in our nuclear verdict society as well, because sometimes it's really hard. I mean, back in the day, you used to be able to say, here's the injury, here's your max value, and be correct at least 75% of the time. I don't feel that it's as accurate to say, here's the injury, the medicine is maybe 50-50, this is how much it should be. I think it's really difficult because so much of it does really vary by jurisdiction, and by this, that I call the Kardashian factor. So I think one of the interesting things we're trying to do to combat that also is we're trying to be more aggressive and working with our defense counsel for making a case for anchoring. I know that can be, a dirty word in some practices, but I think it's more and more important to use anchoring and alternative numbers, because if you don't do that, then the only number they hear is the number that the plaintiff puts out there. Yeah. And sometimes, in these especially really sad cases where there's a really sad outcome, people's general kind of altruistic desire is to help that person. Right. And sometimes if you don't give them a way to help that isn't $30 million, then they're going to pick $30 million. Yeah. Something else that we've played around with and we haven't actually used at trial yet, but I think there's something there, is trying to put the plaintiff's ask in context. So we thought about it in this case that we had in Ohio, and we did not use it. But, it was a working class neighborhood, and they wanted $6 million. And there's, one or two neighborhoods where $1 million buys you a really nice house. And we talked about, hey, should we say it's 6 houses in this neighborhood to give it more context? It ended up electing not to do that, but retrospect, I kind of wish we did, because we got whacked on that one. That happened.
Yeah.
But I wonder if we had put it in more context. I think that the jury still would have found for the plaintiff because it was a sympathy verdict, in my opinion. But I wonder if they would have found as high if maybe we didn't anchor, but maybe we put that number into a realistic context to make it something tangible.
Because look, we talk about that kind of stuff all the time,
Yeah.
We're like, oh, well, what would this settlement number feel like or resonate like with this particular plaintiff? And a lot of times you're like, hey, like if it's put in front of this plaintiff, I don't care what their counsel's saying. This might be a very attractive number for them to take home. So I just curious. I'd be curious to see if you did that, what the reaction of opposing counsel would be to that. I'd be curious to see how.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, but I think there's something there. It's something that it's in our mental crock pot to use in the right circumstances in the right case. But I think there's something there.
Yeah,
it takes it out of the realm of like monopoly money.
Yeah,
and makes it seem real.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, because a lot of these verdicts are just flat out monopoly money.
Yeah, seriously.
And it's so difficult, as my husband always says, he says, you're guaranteed a jury of your peers. And he's like, but I'm not getting a jury of my peers. He said, I wish that the jury was all physicians and they can take a look and see what I did and if it's up to the standard of care or not. But instead, kind of as you're saying, like a lot of times it's the sympathy, it's the outcome, and they're not actually looking at the judge's instructions on what to see.
Absolutely, because there's a huge difference between an undesirable or even a tragic outcome and standard of care. Because standard of care, what I don't think really gets communicated clearly to either the plaintiffs who bring the cases or to the jury, and I don't know what the answer is, but standard of care is not A+. Standard of care is C. It's a C grade. It is not A+ work. It is not an F, but it is a solid C student. That is what standard of care is. And I don't know where the place is, because, that's a tough argument. How do you tell a jury, hey, he wasn't required to be his very best that day? That's not a winning argument.
Right. And I live in a smaller town, and we're not far from Philadelphia, obviously. And people always are like, oh, I'm not going to go see the small town doctor. I have to go see the Philadelphia doctor at the University of Pennsylvania. They're the best. And I think sometimes people have a hard time understanding that. Like, you're not getting the A+, like the top doctor of all time. Like, you're getting the standard of care.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think the frustration for a lot of our emergency room physicians too is that, a lot of allegations and a lot of complaints kind of have this narrative of, well, you should have followed up with them and whatnot. And the emergency room physician's posture is, but I'm not their primary care physician. Right. I don't see these people again almost ever. Right. I see them once, I make sure they're not bleeding, and then I tell them what to do to take care of themselves. And then, you get these complaints that are like, well, you should have done all these things that everybody knows you don't actually do in the emergency room.
Yeah. No. And that's such a good point, though, to bring up, though, too, because you and I had talked about that as well. Like, it's fast-paced, stop the immediate problem, and then provide advice as to follow-up care. Or if they need to be admitted, and then there's additional follow-up care with a specialist of that, like, kind of quality. But, in the emergency room environment, it's either you're getting admitted or you're getting treated and released or discharged and with instructions.
And I think there's some kind of perception in society generally too. And I don't know where it comes from, because personally, I see my primary care physician routinely, and I try to prevent things so I don't end up in the emergency room. But I think too many people use the emergency room as a primary care physician and expect that emergency room physician to fill that role for them, where you are coming to this person in crisis. The purpose of primary medicine is so you can establish a relationship, so somebody can watch you over time, so they can pick up on things when they're small before they become large. And I think there's some kind of disconnect between, I don't know if it's like the Google point and click effect. They're like, at hospital, want problem fixed, or
Right.
what it is, but that's not how the human body works.
And and this is just, have you seen a difference though in maybe some of the types of claims that you see now that there's more of the urgent care facilities, that some people are going to urgent care over the emergency room? I just imagine you're like, because I mean, I know at our doctor, they're like, oh, if you have this problem, go to urgent care. If you have this problem, go to the emergency room. I wonder if you're seeing a shift in what like claims you're seeing as a result of that.
Well, we do not staff urgent care, only emergency departments. So
right.
I'm not sure I would be able to answer that, but I think that probably feeds into the narrative. I mean, you go to urgent care ABC down the street and you think it's the same thing, but it's really not.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking, like,
I think there's a difference between something that's urgent to you and something that's an acute trauma. And I think the emergency room setting is for something that is truly an acute trauma. And maybe the proliferation of those kind of, freestanding urgent cares will change the face, because it's somewhere between. You're not going to see the same people in those kind of settings.
Yeah.
Whereas the primary, sorry, I lost you for a second. The primary care doctor I go to, I see the same person every time I go there, and I go once a year and we talk and, we build a rapport and all of that kind of stuff, because I just want to make sure that I'm continuing to do well. And I think, I'm not sure because the urgent care is something in between. Hey, I need antibiotics because I'm getting on a plane tomorrow and my doctor can't see me to, this second. So I'm going to do that. But, it's different from, hey, I think I broke my arm and I need emergency, making sure that it doesn't poke through my skin.
So do your policies cover any emergency room healthcare provider? Like, have you been seeing an uptick in locums providers?
So that's an interesting question. Obviously, there are shortages in medicine across the board, and we are not immune to that. There are certain states and areas that are more difficult to attract, good physicians to. Emergency medicine is a field that is exciting and fast-paced, but maybe not for everybody. I don't know if that impacts, recruiting. We do use locums in some places, but we strive not to, because for a couple of reasons. Just like anything, somebody who's not, a part of your culture and a part of your organization may or may not give the same kind of dedication that you're looking for from a more permanent employee. So it can happen. And I don't think, we don't use a lot of locums. We use some, but I don't think that that's really, they're covered under our policy just like a regular doctor. And they fill in for times where we don't maybe have enough physicians in that area for that shift or whatever. But I don't think they're a huge problem, other than sometimes it's hard to contact them. So statute of limitations can vary. So if you're talking about, it's usually 2 or 3 years for your statute. So if it's somebody who's a locum who's filling an acute need in 2020, when suit is filed in 2022, is it easy to find that person? Sometimes not. Does everybody remember what happened? Sometimes not. Was that locum familiar with how things were done in that particular facility on a routine basis? Sometimes not. So it depends.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting. Yeah, it's an interesting. I didn't even think about that though too, because I mean they could go back to wherever, and
Yeah.
you might just have to pay on that claim. You give up the doctor.
Yeah, I mean, you know, doctors are licensed too, so it's pretty hard to not be found.
Yeah.
in a specialty so regulated as medicine. But I don't. For us, it doesn't really isn't a metric that we typically track. But you know, I mean, sometimes there's kind of a correlation between your more economically disadvantaged areas with being able to attract talent that wants to stay. And then also with the proliferation of claims in those kind of areas where people have nothing to lose.
Yeah. That's a good point. So we're pretty much out of time, but I didn't want to close up without asking you this, Kitty, you know, knowing what you know now throughout your career and your experiences, what advice would you give your younger self?
Oh my gosh, that's a great question. You know what I would tell my younger self? I would say, stop being so busy making plans, because plans can change. And I think I would tell my younger self, be more thoughtful about your mission statement. I love Find Your Why, one of my favorite books. And I think I would tell my younger self, read that book. Don't be so concerned about, I want to be in this practice at this level, doing this thing by this year. And I think I would advise my younger self, say, what kind of a person do I want to be? What kind of work do I want to do? Who do I want to impact? And how do I want to balance that with my home life?
Yeah, I think that's great advice. So too, because I think we, you know, as our young selves, we probably all had our, you know, our ideas of, you know, our life paths, and looking back, we all know that those paths are sand, and they change.
It's like that episode of Friends where Ross is trying to put the couch up the stairs. He's like, pivot! You have to be able to pivot.
Yes. Oh yeah. I mean, I think we've all had so many pivots in our career, and I think the pivots kind of make us to where we are now, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, I share this a lot when I graduated law school. I mean, or when I was in law school, I wanted to go into real estate transactions, but I graduated at a terrible time to do that. Litigation was not even in the forefront of my mind. I thought I was going to be like closing, you know, deals. But that was a job that was not to be found when I graduated. In fact, I couldn't even find a job. It took me a year to find a job, and I ended up in litigation. Now looking back, I'm like, I'm so glad that I am not drafting, you know, those contracts. I'm like, I would be gouging my eyes out. That sounds terrible. Like, this is way more fun and interesting than that. But you have a certain idea at a certain point. You're like, oh, this is what I want. This is what I think I want. And you just have to be able to adapt.
Yeah. And I guess I would tell my younger self also, don't be so afraid. You know, don't be afraid to try that new thing. Don't be afraid to talk to that person. Don't be afraid to do that podcast.
Yes. Yeah.
You know, take chances.
Yeah. I always talk about that too, because I'm like, originally I was like, who's going to listen to this legal podcast? And now here I am. Like, this is like one of the most fun things I get to do. Eating my own words.
I believe it. I've had an amazing time here today, and I can't thank you enough for having me on.
Well, thanks so much for joining us. And of course, for all our listeners out there, if you like what you hear, please like and subscribe to Claims Never Sleep. You can find us on your favorite streaming platform. And you can also follow us on YouTube if you want to see the video portion of this. So thanks for tuning in.